Swimming in the Dark, Chapter 7. Winter came early that year. Every week pulled us deeper into its gloom. Every day shorter than the last, as if the time was running out. What surprised me most was how calm I was. Maybe it was the drugs. Maybe I was still in another drug-infused dimension. Preternaturally wise. Or maybe I was shock. Or denial. Maybe the whole thing was just too big to comprehend. Or it didn't mean anything yet. There were moments when I wanted to lie on the ground and feel the street's concrete against my face. Just lie down. Stop. To feel the heavy weight on me, feel the bones crack, feel myself drift off to sleep, forever. But all this I pushed back. Amidst the chaos in my mind, I knew that I could not continue my life as it had been. I knew I had to leave. I tried to think of only that, and so, on a terribly grey and cold morning, I went to the passport bureau. It was a tall brown building in a side street in the center of the city, not too far from the National Museum. Where the strikes had been, I went with trembling hands, pushing away the memory of the night I'd released the flyers, my story assembled in my head. I sat in the cold hall, filling out the forms, strangely aware of the handwriting, and whenever I had supplied the official data of my life, feeling as if I was lying. The form asked where I was going, for how long and why, and I stuck my story. For what felt like days, I sat in the dark and drab halls of the bureau, on a hard wooden bench, holding a piece of paper with a number, waiting for it to be my turn. I sat in a hallway and tried not to cry. I wanted to cease existing. I wanted to unbe. I sat in the hallway and tried not to think of you and me. I tried not to think of us, under the covers of your bed. I tried not to think of you, your arms and your hands and your eyes. I tried not to think of all the things I had imagined we'd be together. Return to our lake next summer, move in together someday. Tried not to think of Hanya and your fingers on her sequenced dress. I tried not to think of Maxio or his eyes when he saw us in the forest. I tried not to think of Granny, of Professor Milevich. I tried to imagine my life in the future. In a year or so, I couldn't see anything. I couldn't see anything because anything that was in that moment, no, not even that, was beyond me. I started rocking my legs and feet just to feel something. And then the office closed before my number was called. I left with nothing to show for my time except the flimsy piece of paper whose handwritten number had smudged from my holding it for too long. I went home. I would get used to it. Pani Koleska told me. She made us a sparse dinner, buckwheat with pickled cucumbers and beetroot mash, and we ate with the windows open. The cold drifting in, stirring us, the sound of cars rushing past the streets. We're just queuing for a possibility, queuing for something, maybe queuing for nothing, she said, smiling her sad and loving smile. But it will pass, my dear. Even the longest queue dissolves eventually. The next day I went back to bureau. I sat and read it among rows of others, young and old and ageless, all silent or torpid, reading or knitting or fiddling with their clothes with unnatural resigned slowness, while a large clock ticked and numbers were called out every now and then by a plaintive voice. My body hurt from the bench. I was hungry, but bizarrely, I remained calm. The calm, I think, was still a form of shock. If I had let anything out, it would have overwhelmed me. The fear, the terror of my life alone was always there, like a clasping, growling abyss, waiting to devour me. I can still feel the tremors of that fear today, its echoes firmly anchored under my fingertips, and in that small weightless space inside my lower belly, just inches above the verge of my crotch. At the end of the day, my number was called. I walked down the corridor, my footsteps echoing on the stone floor. I knocked on the door, my pulse thumping in my ears. I obeyed the voice that said, "Come in." The office was narrow and long and dim. I had to walk half-dozen steps to reach the desk, and I strained my eyes to see the man in a tiny patch of lamplight, a bald man with black-rimmed glasses. "Take a seat," he said, his voice formal but not unfriendly. "Take a seat," he said, his voice formal but not unfriendly. "I'm just finishing something." I sat on the chair opposite him. He was bent over some files, absorbed in the contents. His desk was covered in piles of them, neatly stacked blocks of paper. There was only the sound of a clock ticking, slowly, unwillingly. "So," the man said, looking up at me, somewhat wary, bags under his eyes behind his glasses. He opened another file, which I assumed was mine. His eyes scurried over it, moving quickly, and second by second his expression hardened. I thought he'd ask me questions about my trip. I had my story ready, that I was going to visit an uncle in Chicago over Christmas, and that I'd be back in January. I expected him to ask why I had never gone to visit my family before, how I could possibly afford the trip, and how they could possibly know I wouldn't defect. I thought he'd launch into a standard lecture about the dangers of the capitalist world, how they were the enemies of socialism, and how I should never speak to foreigners about politics except to praise the advance and success of socialist Poland. This is what people had said always happened. But none of that happened. Instead, he set the file down for a moment and looked at me with an expression that was impossible to read. "We know about you, citizen," he said with an expectant look. "We know about you." I couldn't breathe. The night of the flyers, the window, the faces staring up at me. Who told them? Had they been following me all along? I couldn't make a sound. The man looked satisfied. "We know about your deviancy, about your pederasty. He said the words clinically, with a detached sort of judgment, the way I imagined he would have said treason. All feeling left my body, as if my cells were deserting me. It was as if someone had hurled me into a vortex, with no up and no down, nothing to hold on to. No one had ever said these things to me, something private, something utterly unspoken, yet essential, was being ripped out of me. I couldn't say anything. Maybe they were baiting me, I thought. Maybe I could argue my way out of this. But I was unable to think or maneuver. I was caught in the jaws of something much too powerful, something that paralyzed me from within, Satisfaction flickered across his face, a face that could have been someone else's, and unremarkable, everyday face. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, knowing I could never go through with this. His face didn't change. He looked back at the flyer. "Does the name Marian Zalewski mean anything to you?" I shook my head, truthfully. With his eyes on the file, he continued. "Zalewski was caught in a Staromiejski Park in Warsaw. Over 3 years ago. April the 23rd, 1977. Engaging in sodomy with another citizen." He looked back at me. He obediently gave us the names of others like him. All the names he knew. All contained in a statement, signed by him personally. "One of them was yours?" He took something out of the file and handed it to me. It was a photograph, passport sized. It showed the face of an old man I had never seen before, staring straight into the camera. His face was deeply lined and hollow, dried, emptied of life. And then, in a flash, I recognized him. It was the man from the park bench, from the night I'd run away from home. The man who told me his life story, the man whose mouth had relieved my anxiety for one night, and whom I had told my name. Instead of anger, a strange sort of tenderness invaded me. He looked so sad, so forsaken in the photo. Fury awoke in me on his behalf. I could see him being dragged out of the park into the back of a police van. I could see him sitting in some cold underground office, beaten, blackmailed, made to sign the statement that now lay neatly before a bureaucrat. "What does this have to do with my passport?" I asked, impatient. "Will you give it to me or not?" He put down the file slowly and folded his hands over it, retaining his calm. "That depends entirely on you, citizen. On you and your common sense." He closed my file, placed his elbows on it, and looked at me with narrowed eyes, his pupils small and intense, like the heads of nails. "If you want your passport, you will do the same thing Comrade Marian did. Supply us with names and dates and circumstances." He pulled out a piece of blank paper from his desk drawer and pushed it across the table towards me. "Right." At first, there was emptiness. Thoughts flew through space, trying to ignite. A sky ready for fireworks. A stage cleared for decisions. But where did decisions come from? I saw you and Hania slung together, dancing oblivious to me on the other side of the window. My stomach began to burn, secreting pain like arrowheads. And then the two of you as a four-legged creature struggling on the forest floor, eating itself, aware only of itself. At the same time, your pleas for trust rang in my ears. Your pleas for my patience. The fire in my belly spread. My back reached for soreness. My eyes stirred and dampened. The man was still there, staring at me, and so was the piece of paper. I felt the pause of time, A moment pulled into its smallest part, spread so thin it threatened to break. When I imagined taking a piece of paper and reaching for the pen, pictured the possibility of it, of writing your name, my arm refused to move. I couldn't feel it. I couldn't feel the fire in my gut. I couldn't feel any pain. I'd gone numb. I don't know what took over then. In the void of the next moment, I guess it wasn't anything distinct. More a hazy murmur, an animal voice, instinct. I followed what it said, what I could make out anyway. I knew it spoke the truth. I opened my mouth. My body felt heavy, absurd, like two fur coats worn at once. No, I said to the man's stony face. I don't have any names. It wasn't easy. He was determined to get what was his. But I knew to persist, knew to take his mounting threats as a sign of progress. I ignored him when he said I would never leave the country in my life and never find a job if I didn't comply. I ignored him when he turned aggressive and called me a pervert and a sick fuck. To my own surprise, I was unable to accept the shame he wanted me to feel. It was too familiar to be imposed. I had produced it myself for such a long time that right then I found I had no space left for it anymore. Instead, I used the truth. I said that I had been drugged the week before and that my mind was addled. The past like a blur. I don't know whether he believed me, but finally, I can't be sure why. He told me I had 2 days. 2 days to come up with names. Before he released me, he put his hands on his desk and said, with a voice measured and sharp like a scalpel, that I would regret it for the rest of my life if I didn't turn up. I nodded and walked out, feeling nothing. Outside, night had fallen. I breathed into the winter air. I knew where I had to go. The tram rambled across the bridge. The trees lining the banks of the river were naked, their leaves having fallen into the water, swept away by the current. The Madonna in the country yard was covered with a layer of frost. The yellow gladiolas gone. Every step of the staircase was an effort. Every creaking one I thought would alert you to my presence. There were no children playing, no people outside, just me and the dark old wood of the house. I knocked on your door, my body a mere shell, my heart beating as if I had climbed the Tatar's range. I wasn't even sure why I'd come. You opened the door and a ripple passed over your face, as if it didn't know what to express. Right then, it showed nothing but determined strength. You looked at me. I looked back, trying to gauge the moment, feeling out of control. You seemed so much taller then, standing above me, looking down. I thought we would stand like this forever. I thought I was too proud to even begin to speak, that I would not beg for anything, that I had no reason to feel sorry. But looking at you softened me. Despite your new hardness, or because of it, It hurt to see you like that, to have nothing pass between us. Then I saw something in your eyes, an opening. Aren't you going to let me in? I said. You stepped away from the door, opening the way for me. It had never been so cold in your room. The heater, a contraption of conjoined wide pipes. Right by the door, with banging and clanging, as if there were a dwarf trapped inside, whacking around with its stick. I was glad I had my coat. I noticed then that you were wearing a thick jumper and a scarf. You closed the door behind me, so you came. It sounded as if you were saying it more to yourself than to me. You stood by the door, looked at me, somewhat helpless, in the middle of the room. Sit. There was nowhere to sit but the bed. It was neatly made and covered with several blankets. On the desk by my window lay open books and a writing pad. I sat on the very edge of the bed, feeling the blankets underneath me, feeling the void where certainty had once been. You stood by the door, your arms closed over your chest, looking at me. Why did you run away? There was reproach and a hint of pain in your voice. The question took me by surprise. I thought there'd be small talk. I thought we would dance around what we really felt. I swallowed, searched for something true and worth putting into words. It was too much, I said, unable to look at you, and it seemed unsayable to me. Continuing was like jumping through fire. You looked straight at me. What? I hesitated, and in that hesitation, resentment came through. That night, when Maxio saw us, what you said to him, and later I saw you in the forest with Hanya. I closed my eyes, exhausted. I didn't want to see your reaction, but I looked up anyway. Your face was hard again, in a different way. Your jaw stiff, your eyes staring at the floor, hooted from me. Suddenly, I felt trapped, seized by a desire to run away. You looked up towards me, your eyes rueful, shimmering. We were all on drugs, Lucio. You never should have seen us. It didn't mean anything. It was a game. It was innocent. You looked at me for a reaction. This was never a game, I thought, and never innocent either. But I couldn't bring myself to say it. It seemed like we'd enter a realm where words had lost their meaning. I just looked at you, saw you struggle, harden again at my silence. You could have said something before leaving, you said, reproachful now. We could have talked about it. You didn't even give me a chance to explain. And now you've ruined it for yourself. With her. Can you imagine that we were worried about you? That we thought you might have run into the forest and be in need of help. You looked genuinely pained, and for a moment I felt guilty. Luckily, her parents told us they'd seen you. They obviously think you're crazy. What are you going to do now, huh? I looked at you, for the first time, I think, with pity. We're beyond that now, I said softly. I'm leaving. The words were like a spell, suspending whatever we'd said before. Fear gazed your face, made your eyes search mine of signs. Where to? You asked, almost in disbelief. The States. The realization spread like water on vapor. Your mouth defeated, your eyes averted. I hated to see you like this. Did they give you a passport? You asked quietly, without any intonation at all. I remained still. Not yet. You nodded, looking at the floor, then towards the window. I wanted you to say more. I felt like I had no more weapons left. You walked to the window, didn't look at me, breathed heavily. Won't you come? I asked, feeling foolish as soon as I said it. You laughed, a quick, short exhalation of a laugh. One that didn't go with your eyes. They were bitter. Why do you need to leave? You said, turning to me. We were so close to getting what we wanted. I considered you, breathed in deeply, closed my eyes for a moment, opened them again. We weren't, Janos. You just thought we were. Don't you see what this is doing to us? It's humiliating. You looked straight back at me. More humiliating than leaving in a freezing attic like a rat? Or that working hard your whole life and getting nothing of it? I thought you wanted a better life than that. I do, I said, feeling cold. I do. You sat on a desk, back turned to the window, your face collapsing into your hands. And I felt tenderness, a possibility. I stood, walked over to you, put my hand on your shoulder. I could feel the tension of your muscles through the wool. Come with me, I whispered. It's not too late. We could go without anyone knowing, across the mountains to Czechoslovakia, then on to Austria. No one will know us there. We'd have nothing, you insisted, from beneath your hands. We don't speak the language. We'd be lost. We'd be free. The room was so filled with us, with the gathering clouds of our words, the fog of our thoughts. I lifted my hand off you. Think of Giovanni's room, I said, the story returning to me through the fog. I think of how David lives Giovanni out of fear. We mustn't act out of fear. You withdrew your hands from your flushed face, staring not at me, but through me. It's too much. Your voice was tired. I can't do it, Lucio. I can't. You're asking for too much. Is it because of Hania? I felt my head spin with fear. You didn't say anything. Look down. Your face still flushed, not moving. It's not that easy, you finally said. Somehow I believed you. Remember how David feels after his decision? I said, feeling my throat tighten. He regrets it. Stop comparing us to a book. Your voice shattered against the walls. Your face was distorted, scrambled up beyond recognition. You're the one who wants to run off. You're the one trying to force me into it. You can't make people love you the way you want them to. I felt life drain out of me, as if a plug had been pulled. I sat down on the bed. I'm not cut out for it, Ludwig, you said, like an apology. I belong here, and I will make it one way or another. You got up from the desk, stepping toward me with new confidence. I met Hanya's parents. I got on with her dad. He will help me move up. I'm sure of it. There was hope in your voice. You almost sounded as if you wanted me to be proud of you. I said nothing. You were only a meter away. I could have touched you if I'd reached out. And maybe it's not too late for you either, you went on. Maybe we can speak to Hanya. Maybe Maxio will never mention what he saw. And I stood. I need to go, I said, knowing it was true. Your face, your limbs, it was as if your entire being was trying to hold itself together, almost shaking from the effort of it. I couldn't bear to see it. I averted my eyes and slid to the door like some retreating thief, stopping in my tracks when you called my name. It sounded like an appeal, a right violated and invoked. My hand on the door handle, my back to you, heart pulsing in my temples. I could sense the word throbbing in the air, my name claiming me. It wrapped its fingers around my shoulders and tried to hold me back. With a terrible jolt, I thrust open the door and hurried down the dark of the stairs. The night had grown colder. The street was empty. The light of the street lamps was dim, and the cursing of invisible drunk men and women pierced the air. I knew you wouldn't come after me, and most of me didn't want you to. But without knowing why, I began to run, fueled by some kind of elated panic. I ran as fast as I could on the forested pavements, alongside the battered buildings, across a naked square. I ran without stopping, feeling the cold stream my lungs, feeling it rush through my head and out, through the warren of the cobbled streets, past the golden dome of the Orthodox chalks, straight on towards the bridge. I ran until feeling returned to my body, until my legs became heavy, until the pain began to prickle, and I was out of options, out of breath. When I stopped, I was standing on the bridge, clutching a rail, bent over like an upturned owl. I drew in deep, hot, thorny breath. My head was spinning. I closed my eyes. I held on tighter to the rail, much tighter, until I sank to my knees and cried out in pain, and felt the cold, hard concrete against me. Later, when the spinning had stopped, the tremor had receded, and the cold of the ground had seeped into my bones, and I knew it wouldn't save me. That maybe nothing could. I opened my eyes and heaved myself up. The city lay before me, oddly turned away from the river, oddly calm. The houses of the old town perched on the hill, the sharp spire of the palace to the left, the block of viscose discernible behind. In the dark of that night, it all seemed barely real. Looking back, I'm surprised I didn't hurl myself off the bridge. I was terrified, saw no way out. But I suppose that right then, in the midst of despair, I felt the stirring of instinct again, the murmur of that voice. I brushed the dirt off my clothes and walked home with a rising fever. Somehow I knew that something would occur to me, a pact I could try to live with. That night, plagued by hot flashes and frenetic dreams, I got out of bed and stood by the window of my little room. Outside the city was a ghost filled by comatose trees. For a moment I thought of you in the room, calling my name as I left. I thought of all the times you had lied, trying to trouble her and me. It was then that the idea occurred to me. I knew without having to think twice that there was no other way. The next morning I left early. I walked from the same spot where we'd met that night, along the avenue by the Alensky Gardens. Its trees and bushes, leafless and naked now. How did my dear cope? I found the side street with a large kamienica. I pressed the button on the intercom. Hello? Her voice clear and untamed. It's Ludwig, I said. Oh, surprise in her voice, a little pause. Come on up. I took the lift, observed my hardened face in the mirror. The last time I'd been there with you felt like a lifetime ago. The door to the flat was open and I came out of the lift. Hanya stood beside it, with a conciliatory smile that pained me. She was wearing a sweater, a long red skirt, and thick socks. We kissed on the cheek. It's good to see you, she said softly, and again I believed her, as I had every time she'd said it. I could hardly muster the strength to go in. The flat looked lighter and bigger than I remembered. We walked through to the splendid living room where the party had been, now deflated by winter light. She made me sit on the white couch. Would you like something to drink? Grapefruit juice? She frowned, sensing my nervousness. Maybe. Some brandy? I shook my head. She sat down, her long skirt falling from couch to carpet. I need to apologize to you, she said, looking at me ruefully, about the night in the country. I'm sorry the Zupa was so strong. I feel terrible about the whole thing. It all went too far, and it was my fault. She looked embarrassed. It's okay, I said, feeling relieved. You didn't know. I'm sorry for taking off without a word. I tried to smile. She nodded as if she'd understood. There was silence for a moment, in which I felt my pulse quicken. I came to ask you a favor, I heard myself say. I couldn't look at her, so I looked at my interlaced fingers, which I had been pressing so hard they turned red and white. I'm in trouble. I need your help. Her eyes widened and she gave me a nod, as if to say, Go on. I told her about the man in the bureau. The words came out more easily than before. I chose them carefully. I told her I wanted to leave to see my uncle, that they were holding on to my passport, blackmailing me. Though I didn't go into detail. I avoided the question for as long as I could, absurdly. And she let me go on. Light shone onto the parquet, making it look smooth and perfect, like the surface of an ice rink. Honey looked at me with concern and sympathy all the way through, and strangely, despite myself, despite all the instincts of pain and revenge and humiliation for having to ask her of all people, I felt a surge of love for the gentleness, the kindness in listening to me. for her ignorance of all that had happened between you and me, and for the innocence as seen through her eyes. Then I finished talking. She put her hand on my shoulder, a hand that weighed almost nothing, and said, "I will talk to my father." I thanked her, but saw that there was something unresolved in her face. She turned towards the large windows, towards the white winter sun. Then she pulled her legs up off the floor and folded them against herself, embracing them and her skirt. "There's just one thing I need to know," she said slowly, looking uncomfortable. "What they are blackmailing you with. It will help to know how to best approach the situation." I tried to concentrate on breathing. It felt like I was falling. I couldn't possibly. "Ludwig? They know that I could face her eyes, couldn't say it. Had never said it before to anyone. Not even to myself. It felt like jumping over a 5-meter wall. "Tell me," she said gently, her weightless hand on my shoulder again. "Go on, don't be scared." I almost crumbled. I took on the words again, as if they had fallen to the floor. I picked them up, lifted them, tried to push them over the threshold, like something immensely heavy that could crush me. "Amma," I tried and failed under her gaze. It was the same feeling, the same pulling to and from, that one feels when standing on the edge of a driving board. "Amma," my voice almost steady, "I'm a homosexual." The word did not tumble. Her face remained calm. The white winter light still streamed into the room as if into a church, illuminating the floor and us. My heart pumped blood around my body, accelerated, but still, and a shiver ran through my entire being, and I felt like something dead and heavy inside had been expelled, as if I'd been carrying a leaden ghost within me all the time. I felt dizzy. I tried to say something else, but there was nothing to say. She took me into her arms, and I allowed her to. Into her soft arms, against her pullover, cushioned by the soft breast beneath it. "It's okay," she whispered. "I understand." She stroked my hair. "You're good. Don't you worry. You'll be fine. You're good." Even if I had wanted to, I wouldn't have been able to stop the tears. They poured out all by themselves, a force of their own, agents of relief and consolation, flooding my face, emptying my mind. And we sat like this, enveloped in one another, in the bright light, for an immeasurable amount of time. When I straightened myself, she left and returned moments after with a tissue. I wiped my face and thanked her. She stood still, looking down at me. "You love him, don't you?" she said softly, neutral, almost as if it wasn't a question. I closed my eyes to say yes, and looked at her, saw that she'd understood. Then a shadow flickered across her face, a trace of doubt. The moment I'd been sure would come. She remained still and looked at me intently, scanning me for reassurance, begging me for it with her eyes. "You and Janusz," she began, but I interrupted her. "He doesn't know," I said, slipping the wet ball of tissue into my pocket, trying not to tremble, to keep my voice steady. "Don't say anything to him." She nodded, her feel dissolved. "Of course not," she said, trying to cover her relief. "I won't." She offered me brandy again, asked me whether I wanted something to eat. I shook my head and thanked her. It was time to go. She accompanied me to the door, hugged me. "I'll call my father now," she said, and assured me they'd do what they could. "Thank you," I said again. She hugged me, this time for longer. "Come back soon." Again, she sounded like she meant it. "I will," I said, almost believing in myself. This morning, I awoke and listened to the gentle traffic outside, the horns of the ships gliding past. Then I got up, took my coat, and walked outside. The snow on the pavement was powdery, shimmering in the sun like shredded glass. It's Sunday, and people were out in the streets, taking their families for a walk. I looked at all of them. It's an impulse I can't seem to shake. To look at everyone I pass, hoping to recognize a face in the crowd, yearning for the familiar. I went towards the water, past the brownstones, their solid, broad stairs leading up to the angels and stars of Santa Clauses in the windows, past the decorations, the abundance. They buried the miners this week. They didn't even say anything about it on TV, Jarek told me. He'd heard about it from home. It seems hundreds of security forces were there to prevent riots. A funeral procession lined by men in helmets in honor of those who were killed by the men in helmets. I felt more sadness than anger. Maybe the year is drawing to an end. There is only so much hatred you can produce, only so much resentment you can hold inside you. Yesterday I tried calling Granny again, and the unthinkable happened. The signal went through. Someone picked up the receiver. "Hello?" I couldn't believe my luck, as if I'd thrown a rope across the ocean and she'd caught it. "How are you?" I asked, again and again, clutching the receiver until my palms turned oily. Her voice was the same as ever. She was fine. She insisted a little too much. She had enough to eat. She stayed in mostly. She tried not to read the news or listen to what the neighbors said. Of course I knew that the line was tapped. That somewhere, in some sad cramped radio room, someone was listening to us. And that Granny was trying to say the right things. "And you, Lucio?" "I'm all right," I said quickly. And then I told her that I was thinking of coming home. That... "Don't," she said, interrupting me, her voice becoming urgent. "There is nothing here. Your suffering won't help us." "Granny," I tried to stop her from incriminating herself, but she interrupted me again. "Stay where you are," she said. "At least it gives me hope. And now, hang up, my love," she added. "This call must be costing you millions." I put down the receiver and buried head in my hands. Part of me still wanted to return, even though I knew that once there they would never let me leave again, even though I knew it was a folly that I'd be a prisoner, but at least I'd be there, inside. I walked to the warefront, to the broken down piers. Across the foamy river, the skyline of Manhattan was drawn against the sky. 100 glistening places of culture assembled next to one another, absorbing the December light. And looking at that light, I thought of Christmas at home, the way we used to spend it. I thought of Granny and Mother, and I buying a carp from the man in the street, picking the fattest one from those swimming around in the metal basins standing on the pavement, pointing our gloved fingers at the same one. We would take it home, let the bath water run, and make it swim in the tub. This was my favorite part. I could give it a name. I would tell it that I'd take it to the Ordra and release it. And I mean it. But then Christmas Eve would come, and I'd be hungry. And Mother would be ready. She'd take it out of the bath, and she'd taken me out when I was small, carefully not to drop it. Then she would cut its head off. She would slice open the body and scoop out its organs like the seeds of a grape. Her hands as red as the devil, blood trickling down her wrists and forearms all the way to her elbows. The day after I saw Hanya, I didn't return to the bureau, like the man in the glasses had made me promise. I sat in my room, stared at my watch, and imagined him at his desk, growing agitated. Every minute after that, I expected a knock on my door. Militant men taking me away, or a representative from the housing board handing me a notice of eviction. But none of that came. Not the next day, and not the following one either. The week drew to a close without anything unusual happening at all, except that it began to snow. Snow tumbled from pillow-white clouds all over the city, dancing giddy flakes, flashy born, covering streets and houses and cars with a sparkling crust, beginning everything to halt for a moment. One morning, soon afterwards, Paniculescu knocked on my door and handed me a big brown envelope. Inside was a passport with a visa. A couple of weeks later, I saw Carolina for a last time. She was waiting for me outside in the snow, a large fur hat on her head, her breath visible in the cold. She smiled when she saw me. "Why didn't you go inside?" I asked, nodding towards the door of the bar. "I wanted to go in with you," she said, kissing me on the cheek, wrapping her arm around mine. Inside, where we were hit by the warm air, the books of the patrons, men young and old, eyed us with barely concealed curiosity, like last time. We sat near the bar and ordered 2 beers. They were playing Donna Summer's latest song, Bad Girls. I tapped along with my fingers. "Funny, you could ask me to meet you here," said Carolina, smiling. "I thought you didn't like this place." I laughed. "I changed my mind. That's loud, right?" "Encouraged," she said, enjoying herself. The beers arrived, and we toasted. Carolina started telling me about the last few weeks, about her dates with Carol. They were in love. I am so glad for you, I said, and meant it. So glad. We ordered another round, toasted again. What about you? She asked. What was it you wanted to tell me? I took a long sip and began to tell her about you and me and Hania. The unanswered truths. For the first time, she gasped throughout, but didn't seem to be surprised. Until I told her about the passport. So, Her eyes began to shimmer. Yes, next week. That's great, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. She looked at her beer. And can't you wait? I think it's time for me, I said. And now that you're the one in love, I'm not going to ask you to come with me. She looked up. Tears freed themselves from her eyes, drawing black path of mascara down her cheeks. She cried noiselessly, and I took her into my arms. When she was done, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror behind the bar and wiped the traces of mascara with the back of her hand. Look at me, she said, breathing out into a smile. I'm a mess. Yes, you are, I said, and I will miss you. Maybe you'll come to join me one day. Maybe, she said, smiling, wiping away the rest of her tears. The day before my plane departed, I went to a bookshop to find an English language manual. Walking into the shop, I saw you, your arm around her waist, looking at the table of books by the entrance. You were wearing a new leather jacket, brown with a beautiful fur collar, and there was a mustache above your upper lip. I froze. It was Hania who looked up and saw me and smiled, and I had no choice but to walk over and say hello, my body numb. The air was impenetrable between us. She kissed me on the cheek. You and I shook hands solemnly. I could feel her looking from you to me with a quiet sort of concentration. Then she excused herself, said she was going to pay for the books. And there we stood, the two of us. You watched her go, avoiding my gaze. Finally, you put your index and middle fingers towards your lips. Want to smoke? We stepped outside under the awning of the bookshop, looking out onto the street. It was cold and sunny. Frost covered the pavements like icing. You took the packet of Marlboros from your pocket and handed one to me. Nice mustache, I said, nervous, when you lit my cigarette and you saw my eyes flicker over your face. Your fingers grazing mine as you cupped your hands to protect the flame from the wind. You ignored my comment. It's platitude. Instead, you lit your cigarette without looking at me and blew the smoke without your nostrils, like you couldn't wait to get it out of you. Then you turned your head in my direction. Your eyes measured me. I sensed that you wanted to say something, readying my body for whatever it was that you needed to come out. Then the shop door swung open and Honey appeared, with a bag filled with books. We stood for a moment, uncomfortable, mourning the missed opportunity. We searched for words, each one of us, trying to say something that meant anything. In the end, we just said goodbye. We said it casually, like we would see each other again soon, or maybe like people who had never been much more than acquaintances. You two walked off, arm in arm, and I watched you, the burning cigarette still in my hand. the last thing you'd ever given to me. I come back home for my walk, take off my coat and rub my hands. I sit down on the couch and stare at the TV without switching it on. I remember how I left our country and how I thought my nightmare of loneliness would return. The nightmare of fossil time, where I walk through that desolate landscape of overgrown gravestones. Not a soul around, condemned to a life among the dead. But it didn't. I came to a new country, a new city, and decided to leave my loneliness behind. America is good like that. Even if it isn't true, even if you can't ever completely shed your past, no one here will tell you that. He makes it easier to fool yourself. You, of all people, must know what it feels like. And yet, it occurs to me now that we can never run with our lies indefinitely. Sooner or later, we are forced to confront their darkness. We can choose the when, not the if. And the longer we wait, the more painful and uncertain it will be. Even our country is doing it now, facing its archive of lies, wading through the long bog towards some new workable truth. 6 months after I arrived here, Carolina sent me a letter about the wedding. That Hania had been pregnant during the ceremony, how it had already been visible. And I cried, despite myself. All this time, I'd meant to ask you whether you loved her. It was the one thing that I regretted not asking. I realize now that it never mattered, because you were right when you said that people can't always give us what we want from them. That you can't ask them to love you the way you want. No one can be blamed for that, and the odds had been stacked against us from the past. We had a manual, no one to show us the way. Not one example of a happy couple made up of boys. How we were supposed to know what to do. Did we even believe that we deserved to get away with happiness? I go to a bookshelf and take out Giovanni's Room, run my fingers over its worn cover. I think of all the eyes that have passed over these pages, all the hands that have felt its weight. And I remember the day my plane was leaving, when Pani Koleska came into my room for the last time, the envelope in her hand with Giovanni's Room inside. I clutched it to my chest like a treasure long lost and now found again. When I opened it with a beating heart, a piece of paper fluttered out, landing gently onto the floor. I adored this book more than you knew. It said in your stocky, right-leaning script, I wanted to keep it, but it's yours. Bring it back one day if you can. I'll be here. J. All this time I realize I've lived like my departure was temporary, your words preventing me from even really leaving or arriving. Despite Carolina's letter, despite the marriage, I've held on to the idea of us. Scanning faces for a scrap of something known, searching through the familiar and the alien. When ready, the familiar had already turned alien, and home had ceased being home. Both have gone on living and changing without me. I close the book and place it back onto the shelf, reach for my coat again, leave the apartment and walk out into the street. The wind sweeps into my face and I brace against it, walking towards the grocery stores on Eagle Street. My belly rumbles. I am hungry. Suddenly, as if I haven't eaten in weeks. I want borscht and pierogi and warm poppy seed cake. And I feel this as a vast, cavernous emptiness inside me, a yearning for warmth. But it isn't painful at all. It feels like a promise. This marks the end of Swimming in the Dark by Tomasz Jedrowski. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next book.